How's it going, everyone? My name is George, and today we are continuing the Thor review series with Thor the Dark World, the 2013 sequel to both Thor and the Avengers, starring Chris Hemsworth once again as Thor, Tom Hiddleston as Loki, Natalie Portman as Jane Foster, and Anthony Hopkins as Odin. This time, the film was directed by Alan Taylor, not Kenneth Branagh, and in this film the Aether, which later turns out to be one of the six Infinity Stones, goes into Jane, and so Thor and the rest of the Asgardians have to get it out of her because Malekith and the Dark Elves are also looking for it. Now, this is the second film of Phase 2 in the MCU. The second MCU film that came out in 2013, Iron Man 3, was the first film. And this is also probably an MCU film that has a reputation for many as being the worst or the least favorite in the MCU. And it's kind of understandable why. This film had probably the most production problems out of any of the MCU films. This had many directors attached to it, including Patty Jenkins, who would later go on to direct the 2017 film Wonder Woman. And a lot of the in and outs with the directors were due to creative differences. And even when they settled with Alan Taylor, there was still some problems. In fact, the director has come out and said like there were a lot of creative differences that messed the film up. And while the MCU has had a reputation of having mostly good films, mostly good to great films, there have been those stories of a lot of clashing between directors and Marvel Studios. This happened with Avengers Age of Ultron. There were differences between Josh Whedon, Kevin Feige, and the crew. So this was another case of creative differences that made I wouldn't say terrible film, but not exactly that good of a film. Yes, I do believe this is the worst of the MCU films. Do I think it's one of the worst comic book movies? No, there's a lot more comic book movies that are worse than this film. This is probably more of a meh, not terrible, but not all that good comic book film. Because on one hand, there are many things that do work in this film that I did like, but then there's many things in this film that maybe the first couple times when I watched Thor: The Dark World, I didn't really notice it all that much because when it came out, I was 17 years old, and obviously the MCU hype was starting to grow because this is like the second film to come out after the Avengers, and I enjoyed the first Thor film, and I know it's an unpopular opinion, but I like Iron Man 3 a lot personally. I know I'm not the only one that feels that way, but for me, I like Iron Man 3 a lot. So yeah, like there was a lot of hype going with this film, and I obviously love the next film that came after this, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. That's one of my top 5 favorite MCU films. So yeah, like I did like this movie for a time, and I'm not saying I hate this movie, but looking back and seeing what we got later on after this film, a lot better MCU movies, this film had a lot of problems. And basically, like I want to get into the good stuff before I get into the bad. So the way the film opens up, it kind of reminds me of basically a epic beginning, like this epic backstory, and it kind of reminded me at first when I first watched the movie a little bit of like Lord of the Rings, like oh, is this gonna be like an epic film? And then you see like Loki like getting imprisoned, and obviously you have Thor and the Asgardians protecting the Nine Realms, and yeah, some really cool stuff here and there. But then we get into the Earth stuff, and it's like this film, for me, it feels like they just really didn't understand what to do with like the Earth setting, the human characters. You have Dr. Selvig going on like this, going crazy. Darcy and this intern have this weird relationship drama. Jane Foster is trying to move on from Thor, then she finds Thor. They get back together. They go to Asgard. It just feels like they really didn't know what to do with some of these characters, and it felt like the only human character that was probably necessary to the plot was probably Jane because she has the ether in her. So it felt like everyone else was not needed in this film. Now the performances from the characters are still very good. Chris Hemsworth's still very good as Thor. Tom Hiddleston's still very good as Loki. Um, Anthony Hopkins as Odin, although I noticed he's a lot more angrier in this film compared to like the previous film. And like 1 minute he'll be like super angry, then 1 minute he'll be very calm, giving this exposition. Natalie Portman as Jane Foster's okay. Like I said, it felt like she was the only human character that was probably necessary for this film. It's the villain Malekith, though, that really holds the film back. This could have been a really cool and powerful villain, but he turns out being one of the more lame MCU villains, and I don't even blame the actor for that. It just feels like they just didn't give this villain a lot of room. I kind of noticed when it comes to MCU villains, I feel like the ones that tend to be more successful, more interesting, are the ones that aren't godlike powerful. Like, yeah, we have some cool godlike villains, like obviously Loki and Thanos, but sometimes villains like Malekith and Ronan don't always land for me. So this was another perfect example of a villain that has the power, but not that interesting of a backstory. It could have been a lot more interesting, but they didn't really do much with it. The special effects are still very good. The soundtrack's still very good. When Thor's mom died, that was pretty emotional, especially with how you see how Loki deals with it. And then you have Thor and Loki working together, which was pretty cool to see. But but then you got like some of the humor, and this is one of those times where you kind of notice that Marvel was relying heavily on the humor post Avengers because the humor worked very well in Avengers. A lot of people enjoyed it, and with Iron Man 3, it worked better with Iron Man 3 because of Shane Black and Shane Black's directing style. Like, he can pull off that MCU humor off well, especially with a character like Tony Stark. In Thor the Dark World, it just didn't land. And it's like a lot of the humor was mostly tied to the Earth stuff. And it's not all that funny anymore. Like the humor in Iron Man 3 and the first Avengers film, I still find funny 9 years later. Not so much with Thor the Dark World. I feel like with Thor Ragnarok, when we get to Thor Ragnarok, when I review Thor Ragnarok, Taika Waititi pulled off the humor well alongside the dark serious stuff. It felt like in here it just didn't land as well. Especially after Loki's supposed death, and I say supposed because it turns out at the end of the film he faked his death. And yeah, it just didn't land that well as it probably could have been. And the final fight to me is probably one of the weakest, if not the weakest, final fight in an MCU film. And like I said, there were things that did work in this film, but then there were things that just didn't work. And I guess it was due to that clash between the director and Marvel Studios. And don't get me wrong, I love the MCU. I still love the MCU. You in Phase 4. I've been enjoying Phase 4 so far. But again, Marvel's not a perfect studio either. There's really no perfect movie franchise except for maybe Toy Story. But even Marvel can make mistakes when they're making their own movies. And obviously those mistakes lied with, having these clashes with directors. That's also probably why Patty Jenkins left the project as well. And I think a couple of other directors also left the project. And the fact that this film's reputation, because of like how things turn out with the film, Natalie Portman didn't want to return as Jane Foster. That's why she was in Thor Ragnarok, and it took Taika Waititi to basically convince her to come back for Thor: Love and Thunder. And it seems like she's had a much better experience making Thor: Love and Thunder than she did with Thor: The Dark World. Otherwise, she probably wouldn't have come back and probably seemed like she's having as good of a time as she did. And there were rumors that Chris Hemsworth was starting to get bored with the character, but then Taika Waititi came along, and now Chris Hemsworth, while he said his contract with Marvel Studios is at an end, he doesn't have a current one after Thor: Love and Thunder. He would love to come back to do more Thor. So I think Thor: The Dark World was also kind of an eye-opening experience opener for Marvel Studios. Say, hey, we got to change this character up because Iron Man trilogy is completed. The first Iron Man film was phenomenal. Iron Man 2 has its fans and its haters. Same thing with Iron Man 3, but at least like Iron Man 3 still made $1 billion worldwide, and I feel like that film has more fans than haters. The Captain America films, the first Captain America film, I love. That has many fans. Winter Soldier, one of the best MCU movies ever made. So it was obvious at that point that Thor was kind of their weakest franchise at the time, and they needed to change things up. And I'm glad that if there was one good thing that came out of Thor: The Dark World not turning out so well, it's the fact that they kind of realized they needed to change things up with the Thor franchise. But all in all, with Thor: The Dark World, I don't hate this film. I have my issues with it, but at the same time, it does have some very good performances. It does have a good film soundtrack. I do like the special effects. The action's pretty cool, but there's just some characters that were unnecessary, some characters that were disappointing. a final fight that just doesn't make sense, and it just felt like that balance of like humor and dark because they did hype this film up to be a much darker film. That balance just did not land. And with Thor Ragnarok, I know some people complain about Thor Ragnarok, but like when I watch Thor Ragnarok, I feel like they execute those very hilarious moments and then those dark moments a lot better than they did in this film. That's just how I see it personally. And this film also made me basically appreciate what Kenneth Branagh did with the first Thor film more. I know I had a few complaints with that film, but I appreciated what he did at least with that film a lot more now. But all in all, I'm gonna give Thor: The Dark World a C plus. I don't think it's a terrible film. It's nowhere near as bad as movies like Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, Batman and Robin, X-Men Origins Wolverine, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I do think this is though the worst MCU film that we've gotten so far. And yeah, I know some people say, well, we've also gotten some iffy MCU films afterwards, but I still prefer those films over Thor: The Dark World. Now, what are your thoughts on Thor: The Dark World? Do you think this is the weakest MCU film, or do you think it's the most underrated MCU film? I know this film probably has its fans, and listen, if you love this film, if it's one of your favorite MCU films, that's great. There's some MCU films that are not that popular that I like a lot. I brought up Iron Man 3 before. There's also The Incredible Hulk. I think The Incredible Hulk is an underrated MCU film personally. So, what do you guys think about Thor: The Dark World? Let me know in the comments down below. And I want to thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe already if you haven't. Please share this with someone that loves the MCU movies, that likes the Thor films. And hope to see you guys real soon. Take care, everyone.